Rain came down in thin, deliberate lines that afternoon, the kind that darkens stone but does not wash anything clean. It fell on the slate roof of the estate, on the hired canopy erected for the auctioneer, on the polished hoods of the cars already sold to men who would never learn the make of the woman who once drove them. It fell, too, on the folding table near the back of the tent, where a battered accounting ledger sat beside a chipped teacup nobody wanted. She stood at that table in a raincoat that had seen 4 winters, her hands folded the way they had folded for 2 decades at bedsides, patient, still, accustomed to waiting for something to change. Around her moved the rest of the family in cashmere and dark umbrellas, already dividing what remained of a life into lots. The house had gone to the eldest cousin, who called it overdue. The cars had gone to the youngest, who took photographs of himself beside them before the paperwork was even signed. The silver, 300 pieces of it, monogrammed, cataloged, insured, had gone to the cousin who managed the family's money and had managed, in the process, to forget the number of times his aunt had eaten alone. When the auctioneer reached the small crate of ledgers and correspondence, someone laughed. Someone always laughs at the wrong moment, when they have already gotten what they came for and have room left over for cruelty. "Give her the book," the eldest cousin said, not quite looking at her. "She likes old things. She's been holding this family together with tape and patience for 20 years. Let her hold this too." There was laughter at that, careless and quick, gone before it finished landing. Someone else added that it was fitting, wasn't it, that the one who spent her whole life keeping records of medications and vitals should end up with a book full of numbers no one could read anymore. The ledger's cover was swollen with old water damage, its spine cracked, its pages fused into something closer to a brick than a book. It looked, to everyone standing under that tent, like the one object in the entire estate with no value at all. She took it anyway, because that is what her hands knew how to do. Take what was offered without flinching, without asking for more. She did not know, standing there in the rain with mud already climbing the hem of her coat, that she was holding more than the house, more than the cars, more than every ounce of that cataloged silver combined. She did not know that inside those fused, water-stained pages was a record her grandmother had kept for 60 years. A record that would outlast the auction, outlast the laughter, outlast every one of them. She only knew that the rain was cold, and that no one had thought to ask her to sit down. To understand what she carried, one must go back 61 years to the spring the patriarch broke ground on the first mill along the Hudson, when the river still ran clean enough to drink from, and a man with rolled sleeves and a surveyor's map could still believe he was building something that would outlast him. He did. The mills came up brick by brick, and with them came the fortune, bolts of cloth shipped south, then west, then overseas. The family name stitched quietly into labels no one in the family ever wore themselves. He married well, or what passed for well in those circles. A quiet young woman from a Poughkeepsie Parish family who arrived at the Stone House with 2 trunks and a sewing kit, and was told, within the month, that the household staff would handle the sewing. She learned instead to keep the books. It was the one task he trusted no one else with, and so, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with convenience, she became the only person alive who understood exactly where the money went. The fortune grew. The marriage did not. By the time her children were grown and gone, one to Manhattan, one to a Newport summer house, both fluent in the particular cruelty of people who mistake distance for success. The patriarch was dead 11 years, and she remained alone in the stone house above the river, in rooms too large for one woman and a cat that had wandered in sometime during the Ford administration and never left. The children visited at Christmas when it suited photographs. They sent cards. They did not send themselves. She kept the house the way she had kept the ledger, meticulously and without complaint. She swept the same floors her husband had never once thanked her for sweeping. She wrote checks from an account no accountant ever thought to question, because who questions an old woman's charity subscriptions, her modest gifts to the church roof fund, her small annual contribution to the county school board? No one looked closely. That was the design. For 60 years, she had been underestimated by men who controlled her money and children who had inherited their father's gift for looking past her, and in that particular blindness, she had found something no one intended to give her. Room. She used it the only way available to a woman of her generation and station, quietly, patiently, one modest transaction at a time, recorded faithfully in a ledger she alone understood, in ink that would one day fade, in the numbers that would one day be mistaken by people who should have known better for nothing at all. Margaret had made the drive so many times she no longer needed the road signs. Route 9 North, past the reservoir, past the feed store that had closed and reopened twice as an antique shop, past the white clapboard church where her grandmother had once played organ for a congregation that had long since scattered to condominiums in Florida, 2 hours each way every other Saturday for 20 years, in a Honda that had accumulated its own private history of coffee rings and gas station receipts. She left before dawn so she could be back by evening for her own shift at the hospital, because caregiving, she had learned early, was not a vocation that paused to accommodate itself. She managed the pill organizer with the particular tenderness of someone who had watched what happened to bodies when no one managed anything. The amlodipine at 7, the warfarin at 8, the eye drops that had to be administered at a precise tilt of the head that only she seemed able to achieve without her grandmother wincing. She balanced the checkbook the old woman still insisted on keeping by hand, long after banks had begun mailing statements electronically to children who never opened them. She noticed, without remarking on it, that certain checks were written to organizations she did not recognize: a scholarship fund in Pittsfield, a clinic outside Springfield, and assumed, as anyone would, that they were the small vanities of an elderly woman's charitable conscience. She did not ask. Asking had never been welcomed in that house. Her cousins, when they spoke of her at all, spoke of her nursing degree the way one might mention a regrettable tattoo. She could have done something with her life, her cousin Diane had said once. At a Thanksgiving, Margaret had cooked and no one had helped clear, emptying bedpans instead of running a company. Her Uncle Richard had been gentler in tone and no less dismissive in substance. Nursing was, in his words, a very generous use of her potential, delivered with the particular condescension of a man who had never once changed his own mother's dressing. Margaret had absorbed these observations the way she absorbed most things in that family, without argument, filing them somewhere below the surface where they could not interfere with the work. The work, in the end, was the only language she and her grandmother had ever truly shared. Not sentiment, not confession, but presence. A hand steadied at the top of the stairs. A thermometer read twice to be certain. A ledger left open on the kitchen table some Saturdays, its columns humming with numbers Margaret never once thought to question, because who questions an old woman's arithmetic, faithfully kept, for reasons that would not surface until long after there was anyone left to explain them? The funeral came on a Tuesday in November, the sky the color of dishwater, the rain falling in that thin, persistent way that never announces itself as a storm, but soaks through wool and shoe leather all the same. The cemetery sat on a low hill above the old mill town, its rows of granite softened by a century of moss, and the family plot modest by the standards of what the family had become, waited beneath a single bare oak whose branches dripped steadily onto the tented chairs. The cousins arrived together, 3 black town cars in procession, as though grief itself required an escort. They wore cashmere the color of the sky, coats that had clearly never weathered a real winter, and they moved across the wet grass with the practiced solemnity of people who had rehearsed sorrow in mirrors. Diane dabbed at dry eyes with a folded handkerchief. Richard stood with his hands clasped before him in the posture of a man delivering a eulogy he had not been asked to give. Their voices, though lowered out of some vestigial respect for the setting, carried anyway, the way voices do across cold marble and wet stone. The Newport house alone, Diane murmured to her husband, must be worth 4.5. Don't forget the textile patents, Richard said. Grandfather's estate never really closed out properly. There's more there than people think. Someone, a second cousin, perhaps, Margaret didn't turn to see, asked whether the funeral home had been paid in advance or would come out of the estate, and there was a brief, business-like silence while this was considered, the kind of silence usually reserved for matters of real weight. Margaret stood at the edge of the gathering, apart from the tent, where the rain reached her more directly and no one thought to offer her an umbrella. She had dressed simply, in a coat she'd owned for 11 years, and she held no handkerchief because she was not performing anything. She watched the coffin lowered, mahogany gleaming even in the gray light, the one extravagance the family had agreed on without argument, and she thought not of estates or patents, but of a hand she had held through 4 separate hospitalizations, of a woman who had asked, near the end, only that the blinds be left open so she could watch the weather change. No one asked Margaret to speak. No one, in fact, addressed her directly at all, except once, when Diane's husband mistook her for hired help and asked, not unkindly, whether the reception food had arrived. Margaret said it had not, because she did not know, and let the rain answer the rest. She noticed, as the crowd began to disperse toward their cars, that no one lingered at the grave the way she did. No one stayed to watch the first spadeful of dark earth fall, or seemed to feel it should matter that someone did. The offices of Whitfield and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had once been a bank, and something of that former purpose lingered in the marble floors and the hush that fell over voices the moment the elevator doors opened. The conference room smelled of lemon polish and old paper, and rain traced long fingers down the tall windows behind the lawyer's desk. He was a man in his early 60s with silver hair combed precisely to one side, and he did not sit so much as settle, the way a man settles into a task he has already decided he dislikes. The family arranged themselves according to an unspoken hierarchy that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with proximity to money. The eldest son and his wife took the chairs nearest the desk, angling their bodies toward the lawyer as though positioning themselves for a photograph. The daughter arrived last, 7 minutes late, murmuring an apology to no one in particular while her assistant carried her coat. She wore black, but the black was cut well, and she crossed her legs and checked her phone before it was even asked of her to put it away. Margaret was given a chair at the far end, near the bookshelf, where the light was worst. The lawyer cleared his throat twice before beginning, and there was something in the second clearing, a hesitation, a held breath, that Margaret noticed and no one else seemed to. "We are gathered," he said, "to read the last will and testament of the deceased, executed and notarized on the 14th of March, revised twice since, most recently 11 months prior to her passing." He paused, straightened a stack of papers that did not need straightening. "I want to say, before we begin, that certain provisions in this document may not align with expectations. I was asked to read it exactly as written. I intend to honor that." The eldest son leaned back, a small, indulgent smile crossing his face, the look of a man humoring a formality he considered beneath him. "Just get to the numbers, Harold. We all know roughly what's there." "I'd prefer," the lawyer said, not unkindly but firmly, "to proceed in the order she specified." The daughter exhaled through her nose, glanced at her watch, said nothing. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, the same posture she had held at 100 bedsides, and watched the lawyer's fingers tremble slightly as he broke the seal on the envelope. Not from age, she thought, but from knowing something the rest of the room did not yet know. He looked up once, briefly, and his eyes found hers before moving on, the way a man's eyes find an exit before he speaks in a burning room. "To my son," he began, and the room leaned forward as one creature, hungry and certain, utterly unprepared for what was coming. The reading proceeded in the order she had specified, and it took the better part of 20 minutes to divide what the family had spent 40 years assuming was theirs. The house on the hill, with its slate roof and its cold conservatory, went to the eldest son, along with the accounts that had funded 3 divorces and a chain of failed restaurants. The daughter received the jewelry, the sapphire brooch, the ropes of pearls kept in a vault most of the year, seen twice annually at events designed for seeing them, along with a portfolio of investments the lawyer read off in a voice that had gone slightly flat, as though even he were tired of the arithmetic of entitlement. The youngest cousin, who had not visited the old woman in 11 years, received a parcel of undeveloped land near the coast and did not bother to hide his satisfaction, murmuring a number under his breath as though calculating it before the lawyer had finished speaking. Then the room went quiet in a different way. The lawyer's finger moved down the page and stopped. "To my granddaughter," he read, and his voice did not change, though his eyes lifted briefly again. "The ledger in the study drawer, and whatever it once meant to me." For a moment no one understood it as an ending. They waited for the clause that followed, the qualifying sentence that would restore sense to the room. It did not come. The eldest son laughed first, a short bark of disbelief that filled the space where grief should have been. "That's it? A ledger?" He looked around at his siblings as though inviting them to confirm the joke. 20 years of bedpans and she gets a notebook. "Perhaps it's sentimental," the daughter offered, though her mouth had already curled into something closer to contempt than sympathy. "Grandmother did love her little records. It's an accounting book," the youngest said, leaning toward Margaret with the particular cruelty of someone enjoying himself. "It's not even leather-bound. Half the pages look stuck together with water damage. I saw it in the study last week. Thought it was headed for the trash before the estate sale." He smiled, not unkindly, which was somehow worse than if he had sneered. "I suppose she wanted you to have something to remember her by." Margaret said nothing. She had learned long ago in rooms far more clinical than this one that silence could be its own form of dignity, that the mouth did not always need to answer what the heart already understood. She thought of the drawer in the study, the one that stuck in humid weather, the one she had opened 100 times to find a pen for the crossword her grandmother pretended not to enjoy. The lawyer folded the paper along its original crease, his hands steadier now, and did not meet anyone's eyes as he set it down. It was the eldest cousin's husband who broke the quiet, a man who had married into the family's money and had spent the intervening decades perfecting its idle cruelties as though they were his by right. He leaned back in his chair, the leather sighing beneath him, and surveyed the ledger on the table with the expression of a man appraising a used car. "Well," he said, "she finally found something as used up as the woman who kept it." The laughter came easily, the way laughter does among people who have never had to earn anything they hold. The daughter covered her mouth as if embarrassed, though her eyes above her hand were bright with the same amusement. The youngest cousin did not bother to hide his grin at all. Someone murmured, "Oh, stop," in the tone people use when they mean go on. Margaret reached across the table and took the ledger with both hands, the way she had once lifted patients who could no longer lift themselves. Carefully, without display, because dignity was owed even to the broken. She did not argue. She did not cry. She had spent 20 years in rooms where families said far worse things to each other over far smaller inheritances than this, and she had learned that a tear given to people like these was a tear wasted. The lawyer watched her fold the book against her chest, and something in his face, a flicker gone as quickly as it appeared, suggested he had expected this reaction and perhaps been waiting to see if she would give them the satisfaction of one. She did not. What she carried instead, walking down the marble steps of the office into a rain that had not let up since morning, was a question she could not set down. Why leave anything at all? Her grandmother had not been a careless woman. She had labeled her medicine bottles by the hour, alphabetized her recipe cards, kept every appointment written twice, once in the kitchen calendar, once in her own private book in case the first was lost. A woman like that did not misplace a leather-bound account book in a locked drawer of her writing desk for 30 years and forget it was there. She had locked it away. Margaret had opened that drawer 100 times for pens, for stamps, for the reading glasses her grandmother swore she didn't need. Never once had the ledger been visible among the ordinary clutter. It had lived beneath a false bottom of tidiness in a drawer that stuck in humid weather, in a room where an old woman had spent 30 years pretending to do nothing more interesting than crossword puzzles. The rain came down harder as she reached her car, soaking through the shoulders of her coat, and she held the ledger against her body the way one shields something living from the cold. Whatever it was, whatever her grandmother had meant by keeping it hidden and yet keeping it at all, it had not been an accident. Nothing about that woman had ever been an accident. The apartment she returned to that night was the same one she had lived in for 11 years, a second-floor walk-up above a dry cleaner where the radiators clanked in October and the windows fogged with the breath of her own solitude. She set the ledger on the kitchen table, still damp, still wrapped in the dish towel she had used to keep the worst of the rain off it, and she did not open it. She told herself she was too tired. Then she told herself the pages were too fragile to handle wet. Then she stopped telling herself anything at all, and the ledger simply became a fixture on the shelf above the radiator, wedged between a chipped ceramic dog and a stack of unread paperbacks, and there it stayed. The weeks that followed had a sameness to them that she recognized from the worst stretches of her nursing years, the 12-hour shifts, the empty apartment, waiting afterward, no one to tell about the small triumphs or the small griefs of the day. Her pension arrived on the first of the month, modest and precise, enough for the rent and the groceries and little else. She did not hear from her cousins, not a card, not a call, not even the courtesy of contempt. Their silence was its own kind of verdict, and she absorbed it the way she had absorbed so much else without complaint, because complaint had never once changed the outcome of anything in her life. She kept busy in the ways available to a retired woman with quiet hands and no particular plans. She walked to the market on Tuesdays. She watered a single geranium on the windowsill until it was the only green thing in the apartment that had not surrendered to winter. She sat some evenings with the television murmuring and did not hear a word of it, her eyes drifting instead to the shelf, to the swollen brown spine leaning against the ceramic dog, and she would think, not tonight, and reach for nothing but the remote. Grief, she had learned long ago as a nurse, did not always announce itself as tears. Sometimes it was simply reluctance, a refusal to touch the one object that might make the loss specific again, might turn a grandmother into a series of numbers and dates and locked drawers. She had cared for the woman for 20 years without asking what waited on the other side of that care. She was not ready, she told herself, to learn there had been an answer all along, sitting in a desk 2 feet from where she used to serve afternoon tea. So the ledger waited. 6 weeks passed, then 8. the rain turning to the first hard frosts of November, before she finally lifted it down one Sunday evening, set it under the kitchen lamp, and understood that avoiding it any longer was its own kind of dishonesty. The cover resisted her at first, swollen along its spine like something that had drowned and never quite dried out. She worked her thumbnail beneath the edge of the board, patient the way she had been patient with adhesive tape on paper-thin skin, and the leather gave, with a small sound like a held breath finally released. Inside, the pages had fused into a single solid block, cockled and warped, the damp having done to them what decades sometimes do to old friendships, pressed them so close together that separating them seemed a kind of violence. She did not force it. She had learned that lesson 40 years ago, standing over a man whose bandage had grown into his wound, and the learning had never left her. What is stuck together by water must be released by water, not by will. She filled a shallow dish with distilled water and began, page by page, a labor so slow it barely qualified as motion, a cotton swab, a held breath, the faintest separation at one corner, then another, the paper sighing apart like two people finally agreeing to speak after a long silence. Where the ink had run, it left ghost marks, pale brown shadows of numbers and names, bleeding sideways as if the words themselves had tried to escape across the page during whatever flood had ruined them. Some entries were still legible enough to read, dates going back further than she had expected, decades, not years. In a hand she recognized instantly, small and upright and economical. The same hand that had once written out medication schedules and grocery lists in the margins of church bulletins. Her grandmother's hand, unmistakably, though younger here, less tremored, ink applied with the confidence of someone who had not yet learned what the years would take from her. She found herself reading not sentences, but fragments, a dollar amount, initials. A word that might have been school, though the C had bled into the H until it was almost unrecognizable. She sat back from the lamp's small circle of light and looked at what she had accomplished in 3 hours. 4 pages, separated, laid flat between paper towels to finish drying, still illegible in places but no longer fused, no longer lost. 4 pages out of what she guessed might be 200. It should have discouraged her. Instead, she felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt since the funeral. Not grief exactly, but its opposite number, a kind of quiet, deliberate purpose. The same feeling she used to get at 4 in the morning on a night shift, when a patient's breathing finally evened out under her hands. She thought of her cousins, warm somewhere in houses that had never needed restoring, and did not begrudge them the thought. She turned back to the ledger. There would be time enough, she told herself, to find out what her grandmother had been counting all those years, and why. The next morning, she went to the hospital supply store on Route 9 before it opened and waited in the parking lot with her coffee going cold in the cup holder, because she had realized at 2 in the afternoon the day before that she did not have the right tweezers. Nursing tweezers were not archival tweezers, she discovered, though they were close enough, fine-tipped, non-serrated, made for lifting a suture without tearing tissue. Tissue. Paper. She had spent 20 years learning the difference between force that healed and force that harmed, and it turned out the lesson transferred. She bought a small humidifier meant for a sick room, a stack of blotting paper, and a tray meant for surgical instruments, and she did not examine too closely why spending $40 on this felt more urgent than paying the electric bill sitting unopened on her counter. By the second night, she had a system. Humidify a page for 11 minutes, no more. She had learned the hard way on page 5 that 13 minutes softened the fibers past the point of separation and the ink simply spread. A small grief she made herself absorb without flinching, the way she had once absorbed the small failures of a shift that could not be undone. Then the tweezers, patient as a held breath, working the corner until it gave. Then the blotting, the flattening, the waiting. It was on page 9 that the pattern first announced itself, though she did not recognize it as a pattern yet, only as strange. She had expected a household ledger, coal deliveries, dressmakers' bills, the ordinary arithmetic of a wealthy household in decline. Instead, she found a column of small disbursements, each one no more than $11 or $12, each one marked with initials instead of names, E.T.M.R., the widow C., and a date. October 1961, December 1961, February 1962. No ledger heading explained them. No corresponding entry showed where the money had come from, only where it had gone. She sat with the page a long time under the lamp, turning it slightly so the light fell across the water-warped surface at an angle, the way she used to turn a chart toward the window when a doctor's handwriting defeated her. The entries continued, patient and small, month after month, need after need, always in that same careful, restrained hand, not accounting for a household at all, she realized, accounting for people, strangers or near strangers, given just enough to matter and never enough to be noticed. She thought of her grandmother's hands, spotted and steady, folding a napkin at Thanksgiving while cousins argued over a car. She thought of the cold blue eyes that had given nothing away in 60 years of family gatherings. She turned to page 10 and did not yet understand what she was looking at. Page 10 held no names either, but it held a place. Schoolhouse, Route 9, Mill Road, $40. And beneath it, in the months that followed, the same notation again and again. A steady tithe, repeated with the discipline of a woman paying rent on something she considered sacred. $40 in 1962 was not a trifle. $40 given monthly for what looked, as she followed the thread down through page after page, to be years, was a woman building something brick by brick in secret, using pocket change she was apparently not meant to have at all. She found the same notation in 1965, in 1971. In 1978, the amount risen to $60, then to $100 by the time the ink began to fade into the water damage that had nearly taken the whole page from her. Whatever this schoolhouse was, her grandmother had not forgotten it in a fit of charity and moved on. She had tended it the way she tended nothing else in that cold house on the hill, quietly, without praise, for what looked, by her rough count under the lamp, to be nearly 40 years. She looked up the address the following morning, coffee going cold at her elbow, and found that Route 9 no longer existed under that name, that the Mill Road had been repaved twice, that the schoolhouse itself had closed as a school sometime in the 80s and reopened, according to a faded county website, as the Pine Hollow Community Library. She drove out on a gray Tuesday, the kind of flat autumn light that made everything look like a photograph of itself. The building was smaller than she expected. White clapboard gone soft gray at the corners, a hand-painted sign swinging gently over the door. Inside it smelled of papers and radiator heat. An elderly librarian, sweater buttoned to the throat, looked up from behind a desk crowded with donated hardcovers. "We've kept this place open longer than anyone thought we could," the woman said, when asked, unprompted, almost proudly. There was a donor, way back. Nobody ever knew who. Checks came every month for years, sometimes cash in an envelope, no return address. My mother worked the desk before me. She used to say some angel kept the lights on out here. She smiled, folding her hands. Whoever it was, they never once asked for a thank you. Margaret stood very still among the shelves, in a room that had once held desks and chalk dust and small, hard benches, now holding paperbacks and a coffee urn and a bulletin board of flyers for a knitting circle. She thought of the initials in the ledger, The careful discretion of them, the years of quiet $40 checks written by a woman who let her own family believe she loved no one. She did not yet know how many other rooms like this one existed somewhere in the state, waiting, unnamed, in the pages still fused shut at the back of the book. The county archive occupied the basement of a building that had once been a bank, and the vault door still stood open on its hinges, propped with a rubber wedge as though the town had decided that some doors should never again be allowed to close. Margaret came on a Tuesday, the ledger photographed page by page and left safely at home. Only her notebook and a folder of transcriptions in her bag. The archivist, a young man with ink-stained fingers and the patient manner of someone who loved paper more than people, brought her boxes without asking why. Hospital records, he said, digitized only through the 90s. Before that, it was all bound volumes, fragile, handled with gloves. She wore the gloves. She turned pages slowly, the way she had once turned patients, carefully, respectfully, aware that everything fragile deserves to be moved gently. The maternity ward logs from the county hospital ran in tight columns, dates, names, attending physicians, and a column marked balance due, most of it scratched through in a hand she did not recognize, marked paid in full by anonymous fund. She had seen those words before, not in a hospital ledger, in her grandmother's. Her hands went still over the page. She reached into her folder and drew out her transcription, running her finger down the dates. March 1974. An entry for $60, initialed only with a small, deliberate M. In the hospital's own log, the same month, 4 uninsured mothers had their bills forgiven in a single week. She turned another page. October 1979, the ledger recorded $110, no explanation. The hospital record showed a difficult birth, an emergency transfusion, a bill of exactly that amount, closed out 3 days later. She sat with that for a long moment, the fluorescent light humming overhead. The archivist, somewhere behind her sorting index cards. It was not one coincidence. It was a pattern stretching across a decade, then another. 1981, 1984, 1988, women whose names she would never know, whose children were now themselves approaching old age, all of them delivered without debt because a woman 40 miles away had quietly decided that no mother should leave a hospital owing money for the privilege of surviving childbirth. Margaret thought of her grandmother's hands, the ones she had once bathed and bandaged, dry and spotted and folded so primly in her lap during every visit, giving away nothing. Not a story, not a name. Not once, in 20 years, a single word about any of this. She closed the ledger transcription gently, the way she had learned to close a chart at the end of a long shift, and asked the archivist, in a voice she kept carefully level, whether the hospital still had any records from further back, the 50s, the 60s, anything predating the maternity logs. He disappeared into the stacks without answering directly and came back 20 minutes later carrying a box marked, in faded marker, Discontinued Charity Fund, 1962. The box smelled of nothing so much as time, that particular staleness of paper that has been folded and unfolded by hands now dead, then left to dry out slowly in a room where no one thought to open a window. Margaret set it on the table with both palms, the way she might have lifted a fragile patient's arm, and did not open it right away. She let it sit. She had learned, in the ledger's restoration, that some things needed a moment of stillness before they could be touched without damage, and grief, she was beginning to understand, worked on the same principle. She thought, not for the first time, how little she actually knew of the woman before the marriage. There were no photographs from that early period in any album she had ever been shown. Only the wedding portrait, stiff and formal, a young bride standing beside a man 20 years her senior, whose family had built its fortune 2 generations before either of them was born. The textile mills, the freight lines, the land holdings, all of it inherited, passed down through marriages and mergers long before her grandmother had ever signed her name to anything. She had married into money. She had not made it. And yet here was a box marked 1962, 3 years before Margaret herself had been born, already containing whatever this was. Already, it seemed, in motion. She wondered what kind of young woman walks into a marriage like that, into a name like that, and begins almost immediately giving pieces of it away. There was no record of hardship in what Margaret knew of her grandmother's girlhood, no orphaned upbringing, no scraped-together survival that might explain a hunger for justice on behalf of the poor. If anything, the family lore suggested comfort, a modest but respectable upbringing in a river town 2 counties over, nothing that would account for 60 years of quiet, methodical redistribution. Margaret sat with that unanswered question the way she used to sit with patients whose charts told her everything except the thing she most needed to know. Not what was wrong with them, but who they had been before illness made them small. She lifted the lid of the box at last. Inside, the papers were older, more brittle, typed on a machine with a crooked lowercase e. The ink faded to the color of weak tea. A cover memorandum dated March of that year, addressed to no one Margaret recognized, referenced a continuing arrangement per Mrs. Mike's instruction. And then beneath it, a list of names. Mill families, it appeared, given small sums for medical bills, for coal, for a child's shoes. Dated years before Margaret had been born, before her mother had been born, before anyone still living could testify to how it had begun. Whatever this was, she understood now, had not started with her. It had not even started with her mother. It had started with a young bride, alone in a house full of other people's money, deciding what she would do with it. The kitchen had gone dark around her without her noticing, the way it did now that she measured evenings by pages rather than hours. She turned on the lamp her grandmother had once kept beside her reading chair. Margaret had claimed it from the estate sale for $4, over the protest of a cousin who wanted it for the guest cottage in Nantucket, and drew the box closer. The next folder held receipts, brittle as dead leaves, for a scholarship fund at a schoolhouse 2 counties over, the kind of place that existed on county maps but nowhere else. And tucked between 2 receipts, folded twice, was a single sheet in different handwriting than the typed memoranda. A woman's hand, careful and upright, the ink browned but legible. The promise made in 61 still stands, it read. He must never know how much or from where. Margaret read it 3 times before she let herself breathe normally again. 1961. Her grandmother would have been 26 that year, already 3 years married, already. Margaret did the arithmetic without wanting to, already carrying the weight of a fortune that was never legally hers to give. She turned the page over, looking for more, and found instead a torn corner, ragged and deliberate, where a name had clearly once been written and just as clearly been removed. Not faded, not lost to water or time, torn. The tear ran clean through 2 other words so that only fragments remain, witnessed by and beneath it the ghost of a descender, the tail of a letter that might have been a G or a Y, and nothing else. Someone had wanted this erased, and had wanted it erased badly enough to sacrifice the page around it. Margaret set it down and pressed both palms flat against the table, the way she used to steady herself before delivering news to a family that would not want to hear it. Her grandmother had been 26. Her grandmother had made a promise that year, To whom, she couldn't say, only that it had been kept for the better part of 6 decades, quietly, methodically. A woman moving money like water finds a crack in stone, drop by drop, never once announcing herself, and someone, her grandmother most likely, though Margaret could not yet rule out another hand, had gone back afterward and torn out the one name that might explain why. She thought of the husband. The grandfather she had known only as a photograph on a mantel, stern-jawed, unsmiling, a man who had built a textile empire out of other people's labor and never once, as far as she could learn, asked where his wife spent her afternoons. He must never know. Not the amount, not the source. Margaret turned the torn page toward the lamp, tilting it, searching the fibers for some indentation the pen might have left behind, some pressure that ink alone couldn't erase. There was something there, fainter than a watermark, waiting to be found. The indentation gave her nothing that night, only a faint pressure she could not decipher without better light and steadier hands than the hour allowed. She set the page aside, wrapped in its acid-free tissue, and did what she had learned to do in 20 years of night shifts when a chart refused to make sense. She went looking for someone who remembered. The woman lived in an assisted facility 40 minutes north, in a room that smelled of lavender and boiled linens, her hands curled with arthritis around a cup of tea she no longer lifted without help. She was 93. She had grown up 2 farms over from the orchard where her grandmother had been a girl. And when Margaret said the name, the maiden name, the one from before the marriage, something in the old woman's face opened like a door that had been shut a long time but never locked. She wanted to teach, the woman said. Did you know that? Wanted it the way some girls want a husband. She had her letter from the normal school in her hand. I remember because I was there when it came. We were sitting on her mother's porch step, and she read it out loud twice like she didn't trust it the first time. Margaret said nothing. She had learned, in hospital rooms, that silence was the surest way to keep a memory unspooling. Then the marriage came along. Arranged, mostly. His family had the mills, hers had the land, and somebody's father decided the numbers matched better than any 2 people ever could. She didn't fight it. Girls didn't. Not there, not then. But I watched her fold that acceptance letter into a hymnal and never take it out again. Not once, in 60 years, did I hear her say she regretted it out loud. But I watched her eyes when she passed the schoolhouse every single time. The old woman's cup trembled, tea threatening the saucer's edge, and Margaret reached to steady it without thinking, the way she'd steadied 10,000 cups before. She used to say the classroom would have been hers to run, the woman went on, quieter now. Her own room, her own children to shape, not born to her but chosen. She never got that room, but you'll notice, won't you, how many rooms got built instead? Margaret felt something shift in her chest, some tumbler falling into place. Not a marriage of love, not even one of simple convenience, a life exchanged for a mill and a name, a woman's ambition folded into a hymnal and never spoken of again, and yet schools, clinics, a ledger heavy with the names of children she had never taught, never mothered, but had built rooms for anyway, year after year, dollar after quiet dollar. Margaret thanked her, kissed the papery cheek, and drove home through a dusk the color of weak tea, already knowing the torn page was not an accident of guilt. It was the first page of a promise being kept. At her kitchen table that night, under the same lamp that had watched her through 100 restorations of other people's memories, she opened the ledger again with the particular reverence of someone who now understood what she was reading. The torn page was not vandalism, it was excision. Someone, 60 years ago, cutting away evidence with the same care a surgeon takes to leave no scar behind. She traced the ragged edge with one finger and thought of the woman's trembling teacup, the unspoken sentence about rooms that got built instead. She began cross-referencing, not with any grand method, only the patient, methodical habit of a woman who had once tracked medication schedules for 11 patients at once, matching names to dates to dollar amounts with a nurse's unforgiving thoroughness. The mill payroll ledgers, borrowed briefly from the county archive, listed wages that had shrunk year over year in careful 2 and 3% increments. Reductions attributed, in her grandfather's looping hand, to efficiency adjustments. And in the same years, in the same months sometimes, the household ledger recorded outflows to entities with names like Fall Hollow School Fund and Cardinal Street Clinic Building Materials. The amounts nearly matched. Not exactly. Never exactly. A woman clever enough to avoid suspicion would never be so careless. But close enough that a nurse who had spent a career noticing the difference between a fever of 99 and 101 recognized a pattern when she saw it. Her hands went still over the page. It was not charity in the way the world understood charity, some idle scattering of surplus. It was redistribution, deliberate and disguised, a woman taking back with one hand what her husband's mills had taken with the other. Wages shaved from workers' pay had found their way, laundered through years in hymnal societies and building committees, into schoolrooms and infirmaries for the very families who had been shorted. Penance disguised as piety, reclamation disguised as duty. Margaret sat back in her chair, and the apartment was very quiet, only the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the radiator marking time. She thought of the woman at the church, tea trembling in her cup, saying the classroom would have been hers to run. She thought of a marriage that had cost a woman her name, her ambitions, 60 years of a room she never got to have, and how, brick by brick, dollar by quiet dollar, she had built that room anyway for other people's children under a husband's roof and a husband's money and a husband's oblivious signature on every check. It was not forgiveness, Margaret felt, turning the fragile page. It was something closer to recognition, the particular ache of understanding a person, finally, after they're already gone. She reached for her magnifying glass in the next page and did not stop, though it was past midnight, though her tea had gone cold beside her exactly as her grandmother's must have gone cold 1,000 nights. In that same house of quiet arithmetic, it was 3 pages later that her thumb caught on something that did not behave like paper. Most of the ledger had grown brittle in the manner of old things left too long in damp rooms, willing to crack, unwilling to bend. But this page resisted differently. It gave nothing at all. 2 leaves had fused into a single stiff plate, the fibers welded together by whatever water had once pooled along the spine and never properly dried. She held it to the lamp and saw, faintly, the ghost of ink trapped between the layers like something pressed under glass. She did not try to pry it. She had spent 20 years learning what happens to tissue that is forced. Instead, she filled a small pot, set it to a bare simmer, and held the fused page above the rising steam the way she had once held a compress above a bedsore too fragile for direct heat, close enough to soften, far enough not to scald. She counted her breaths. 30 seconds. She lowered the page, touched the edge with the flat of a bone folder, felt only the faintest give, and stopped. Patience, her supervisor had told her once, in another century, in another building that smelled of bleach and boiled linens, is not a virtue. It is a technique. She did this for 4 evenings. Each night she permitted herself only a fraction of an inch of separation, easing the steam along the seam, then setting the page beneath a sheet of blotting paper in a small glass weight and walking away to wash a cup, to water the one geranium that had survived her move, to sit very still and let the humidity finish what her hands could not rush. On the second evening, the fibers parted perhaps a quarter inch, releasing a smell of scorched dust and something sweetly chemical, old glue giving up its hold at last. On the third, she saw a line of handwriting begin to surface, smaller than the ledger's usual entries, tighter as though written with the door locked. By the fourth evening, the 2 leaves lay open on the table like something surgical. Successfully separated tissue, still fragile, still needing to be dried flat under weighted glass before it could be touched again. She did not read it that night. She made herself not read it. She had learned in 30 years of nursing that some things must be allowed to finish becoming what they are before you look at them directly, or you risk tearing what you have only just saved. She covered the page with a clean cloth, set the weight, and turned off the lamp. The radiator ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere below, a neighbor's television murmured through the floor, ordinary and oblivious. Margaret sat in the dark a long moment, hands still faintly trembling, in the particular way they used to after a long shift, after holding someone through something neither of them could yet name. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow it will be dry enough to read. Morning came gray and unremarkable, the kind of light that made no promises, and she was glad of it. Drama, she had learned, belonged to the evening. Mornings were for work. She made coffee she did not drink, let it go cold on the counter while she washed her hands twice, dried them on a clean towel reserved only for this, and sat down at the table where the 2 leaves had spent the night flattening themselves into honesty. The glass came away with a small sound, like a held breath released. The cloth beneath it had done its job. The page had dried true, no curling at the edges, no fresh cracking. She allowed herself, finally, to look. The handwriting was her grandmother's, but a version of it she had never seen in the ledger's ordinary columns, not the brisk accountant's hand that tallied donations and dates, but something looser, more urgent. The hand of a woman writing quickly before she could talk herself out of it. It filled the page, edge to edge, no margins, as though she had been afraid of running out of room or time or nerve. Margaret did not read the words yet. She read the shape of them first, the way she used to read a patient's face before she read their chart. The tremor in certain letters, the pressure that darkened some lines and let others go pale, the small tear at the top right corner where the pen had caught, and she had pressed on anyway. Then she saw it. Not the body of the letter, but its address, written across the very top in a hand that had clearly been deliberate, unhurried, sure of itself in a way. The rest of the page was not. To whoever finally has the patience to read this, she sat with that line a long time before going further. It was not addressed to a name, not to a lawyer, not to a daughter, not even to Margaret herself. It was addressed to a quality, a capacity, as though her grandmother had understood 60 years ago or 6 months ago that money finds its way easily to the greedy and rarely at all to the patient, and had decided, with whatever strength was left in her hands, to correct that arithmetic one final time. The coffee had gone fully cold. The radiator had stopped its ticking. Outside, a delivery truck idled at the curb, someone's ordinary Tuesday continuing in the ordinary way, indifferent to the fact that in a small apartment 2 flights up, a woman who had spent 20 years unseen was sitting perfectly still, her fingers resting just above a letter, She had not yet allowed herself to read, as if touching it too soon might still, somehow, cost her everything. She read it the way she had once changed dressings on the worst burns, in small movements, pausing whenever the pain threatened to outrun the healing. The handwriting steadied as it went, as if the act of writing had itself been a kind of medicine. I married into a fortune I never asked for and spent the rest of my life trying to give it back, the letter said. Not out of guilt, out of hunger to be free of it. Every dollar my husband earned came with a debt attached: obedience, gratitude, the performance of being grateful for a cage lined in silk. I could not refuse the house, the name, the standing, but I could refuse to let the money own the only thing it had not yet touched, which was my own conscience. She described the first donation, $400 to a one-room schoolhouse outside the mill town, made the same autumn her husband bought his second car. She described learning, slowly, patiently, over years, how to move money in ways a husband too busy with his own reflection would never think to check. Land parcels signed over through intermediaries, scholarship funds routed through churches that asked no questions, a clinic's boiler replaced in the dead of a January that no one in the family ever knew had been cold. 60 years, the letter said, of taking back a little at a time, so quietly that no accountant, no son, no husband ever noticed the shape of what was missing until it was already gone. Margaret's hands had begun, without her permission, to tremble. The final paragraph was shorter and colder in the way that only true tenderness can be cold, stripped of all performance. There's one account I did not touch, opened in 1987, added to in silence every year since, meant for no cause and no institution. I did not know, when I opened it, whose name would belong there. I only knew there would eventually be someone who cared for me, without asking what it would cost them to do it, and without asking what they might get in return. I have watched you all these years not ask. Beneath it, in ink slightly darker as though written at a later sitting, the account is not part of the estate. It was never part of the estate. It was never anyone's to divide but mine, and now it is yours. There was no dollar figure. There was, instead, a small string of numbers Margaret did not immediately understand, and beneath that, a single institution's name, printed in a hand, too careful to be anything but deliberate. She read it twice more before she trusted herself to stand, and even then she did not move toward the telephone. She sat instead with the letter flat against her palms, the way she used to hold a patient's hand in the last hour before dawn, when nothing needed to be said and everything already had been. She telephoned the lawyer the following morning, not because she doubted what she had read, but because 40 years of nursing had taught her that certainty without confirmation was simply hope wearing a formal coat. He asked her to bring the ledger in, and when she arrived, rain damp again, the same rain, it seemed, that had followed this whole affair from graveside to auction floor to her own kitchen table. He read the final pages twice, then a third time, adjusting his glasses each time as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more ordinary. They did not. "This is a trust instrument," he said finally, turning the ledger so the last leaf faced the window light. "Drawn privately, notarized 11 years ago by a colleague of mine who has since retired in an office 2 counties over." He tapped the string of numbers Margaret had not understood, an account number, and this, his finger moved to the institution's name, is not a charity. It is a private trust company, one that exists, as far as I can tell, solely to administer this. He made 2 calls before noon, his voice modulating from professional to something quieter each time he set the receiver down. By the second call, his hand was no longer entirely steady. "It's real," he said, and there was something almost apologetic in how plainly he said it, as though he were the one delivering an insult rather than its opposite. "It is entirely separate from the estate you saw divided in my office. It was never part of the inventory. It was never meant to be." He paused. "It is substantial, Mrs. Calloway. I want you to understand that before you leave this room. It is not a token. It is not a kindness meant to make you feel remembered. It is several $1,000,000, and it is, as of this morning, irrevocably yours." Margaret sat very still, the way she had learned to sit still beside deathbeds, when movement felt like an intrusion on something too large for the room. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist against the glass, and somewhere below, a delivery truck idled at the curb, its ordinary business a strange counterweight to what had just been said aloud. "She hid it," Margaret said, not quite a question. "She protected it," the lawyer corrected gently. "There is a difference, though I understand it may not feel like one yet." He slid a folder across the desk, thick with documents bearing seals and signatures from years Margaret had not thought to look for, and told her, in the same careful voice he might have used to describe a diagnosis, that there would be paperwork, verifications, a formal reading, and that her cousins, when they learned of it, would not receive the news quietly. "They did not," he said again, as if the repetition might make it easier to absorb. He rose from his chair, crossed to the window, and stood for a moment with his back to her, watching the mist gather on the glass in a way that suggested he needed the pause as much as she did. "I have wondered about this account for 11 years, he said finally, "since I first took over her affairs from my predecessor. There was a line item, a standing instruction, that made no sense to me at the time. Funds moved quarterly, always the same modest sum, always to the same holding entity, never touched, never explained. I asked her about it once, only once." He turned back to face her. "She told me some things are not meant to be understood by the people managing them, only by the people who earn them." He said this without embellishment, the way he might report a fact from a ledger, and yet Margaret heard, beneath the flatness of it, something that sounded almost like awe. I did not press further. It was not my place, but I confess it troubled me. The silence around it, the insistence that it remained separate from everything else, untouchable by the estate, untouchable by probate, untouchable by anyone who did not meet a single, very specific condition. Which was, he almost smiled, which was you, though she never wrote your name, not until the letter. Margaret's hands had gone still in her lap, the way they used to still over a patient's chart when the numbers on the page finally explained the fever. She thought of the ledger at home, still spread across her kitchen table under its careful weights, the ink she had coaxed back from 60 years of water damage. She thought of the anonymous checks to the schoolhouse, the clinic, the Mill families whose names she now recognized without having ever met them. She thought of a woman who had spent 6 decades quietly giving away a fortune built on other people's labor, and who had, in the last accounting of her life, given away one more thing. The only thing, it seemed, she had ever meant to give without condition. She wanted to be certain, the lawyer said, that whoever received this had not asked for it, that they had come only because they cared, and would have come the same whether there was money at the end of it or not. He looked at her with something that was not pity and not charity, but recognition. "I believe she was certain, Mrs. Calloway. I believe that is precisely why the account exists." Outside, the mist had begun, very faintly, to lift. It took 3 weeks for the filing to surface, the way such things do. Buried in a county courthouse's public record, the kind of document no one reads unless they are looking for something to salvage. Her cousins were looking. The venture they had poured their inheritance into, a chain of boutique fitness studios bearing one of their names in gold cursive across the storefront glass, had folded that spring, its equipment repossessed, its leases in default. They had spent quickly and confidently, the way people spend money they believe will always replenish itself, and when it did not, they went looking for what else might be owed to them. They found her on a Tuesday, standing in her kitchen with the ledger still open beneath its glass weights when the knock came sharp and impatient against her door. We know about the trust. The cousin who had once called the ledger a rat's nest stood on her welcome mat in a coat that had cost more than Margaret's monthly pension, though it had, she noted, begun to fray at the cuff. Several $1,000,000 outside the estate. You can't tell me that's fair. It isn't a matter of fair, she said. It's a matter of what she wanted. She was our grandmother, too. She was. Margaret did not raise her voice. She had spent 40 years speaking calmly to frightened people, and she found the habit did not leave her now, even here, even with this. And she watched what each of us did with the years we were given. That was her arithmetic. I didn't set the terms. You could share it. No one would have to know how it started. I would know, she said, and something in the quiet finality of it seemed to land harder than any anger could have. Behind the cousin, a second one shifted her weight, glancing past Margaret into the apartment, the crowded shelves, the modest table, the ledger she still could not bring herself to close. There was for a moment something almost like shame in her face, quickly swallowed. You always did think you were better than us, the first cousin said, playing the martyr, wiping her chin, and now you get to play the saint too. Margaret held the door, neither wide nor narrow. I get to keep the promise she made, that's all. I'm sorry the studios didn't work out. She meant it, and did not enjoy meaning it, but this was never mine to give away twice. She closed the door softly, the way she had learned to close a door on a room where someone was finally, mercifully asleep. The 2 years that followed did not announce themselves. They arrived the way most real change does, in increments too small to photograph. A check written on the first of the month, a phone call returned before 9, a Tuesday given over to paperwork instead of rest. She established the scholarship in March, in a conference room that smelled of coffee and new carpet, and she insisted the paperwork name it after no one. The dean argued gently for a family name on the letterhead. Donors like to see their history, he said. It encouraged others to give. And she told him the history was already written down in a book he would never see, and that was enough. The fund would carry the profession's name, not hers. Nursing. That was the whole of it. He relented, the way people usually did once they understood she was not negotiating, only informing. The schoolhouse library took longer because old buildings resist rescue, the way old bodies do, with a stubbornness that looks like refusal but is really just fatigue. She replaced the roof before the windows before the paint, because she had learned in 40 years of nursing which repairs kept a thing breathing and which merely made it presentable. The clinic, 2 towns over, needed less romance and more plumbing. She gave it both, quietly, through the same attorney who had once slid a folder across a desk and watched her hands shake. The ledger itself she finished last, as though some part of her understood that once the pages were fully unstuck, fully flattened, fully hers to close, the woman who had filled them would recede 1 degree further into history. She worked on it most evenings, under the lamp, with the patience of someone who had spent a career waiting for vital signs to change. When it was done, every page legible, every column restored to the light, and she did not keep it. She drove it herself to the county archive on a gray Thursday in October in a box she had built to the archivist's exact specifications, foam-cornered, acid-free, labeled in her own careful hand. The young woman behind the desk turned the first few pages with cotton gloves and asked, almost shyly, who had done the restoration. Margaret said only that she had known the woman who kept it, not that she had loved her. Not that love was, in the end, the only entry in the whole ledger that had never needed correcting. She walked out without the box, her hands strangely light, and stood for a moment on the courthouse steps in the thin autumn sun, feeling, for the first time in 2 years, that there was nowhere left she had to be. 5 years passed, the way years do when a life has finally settled into its proper shape. Not slowly, exactly, but without the old urgency, each one folding into the next like pages that had already been read. The nursing scholarship graduated its first class, then its second. The schoolhouse got a new roof. The clinic, which had once operated out of a double-wide trailer with a generator that failed twice a winter, now had a brick facade and a waiting room with real chairs, and nobody who sat in them ever learned the name of the woman whose money had put them there. That, Margaret had come to understand, was precisely the point. It had always been the point. She visited the grave in October when the light in that part of the valley turned the color of weak tea and the maples along the cemetery fence dropped their leaves in slow, deliberate spirals as if they too had learned patience from someone. The stone was modest, granite, unpolished, the kind the old woman would have chosen for herself rather than the kind her husband's family would have chosen for her. Margaret brought no flowers that year. She had decided sometime in the second winter that flowers were an apology, and she owed none, and neither, she suspected, had the woman beneath the stone. She stood there a long while in a coat that had grown soft with age, her knees complaining faintly the way knees do after 60, and thought about arithmetic. Not the kind on a ledger page, though she thought of that too, of the small looping numerals that had cost her a summer to restore, but the other kind, the kind that had no columns and balanced anyway. 20 years of Tuesday afternoons, a hand held through a night that did not end well. A ledger kept in secret because the keeping of it was the only freedom left to a woman married into money she had never been permitted to touch. She understood now what she had not understood at the will reading, standing in that cold office while her cousins laughed that her grandmother had not been hiding money from her family. She had been hiding herself, restoring piece by piece over 60 years a self that marriage had tried to erase, the way water had once tried to erase these very pages, and she had left the last of that self quietly to the one person who had never asked to be given anything. The wind moved through the maples. Somewhere past the fence a school bell rang, faint and ordinary, for children who would never know whose care had funded their books. Margaret touched the top of the stone once, the way she used to check a pulse, and found, as she always did, that everything here was steady.